The 2,850,000 decision at exactly 2:17 p.m. My aunt smiled as though she were performing an act of love. The conference room overlooked downtown Atlanta through floor-to-ceiling windows. Sunlight reflected off polished glass towers while the air conditioner hummed softly above us. The mahogany table between us held a thick stack of legal documents, a silver fountain pen, and the future of my family's legacy. Exactly 2,850,000 worth of property, investment accounts, and trust assets. Every dollar had once belonged to my grandmother. Every dollar was about to leave me behind. I folded my hands in my lap and watched without saying a word. Across the table, my Aunt Denise adjusted the sleeve of her cream-colored jacket before signing another page. She never looked nervous. She looked victorious. "The children deserve stability," she said with a satisfied smile. Mama always wanted the family protected. Her children. Not me. The attorney nodded politely while turning another document toward her. I recognized the paperwork immediately. Transfer of ownership. Distribution schedule. Beneficiary confirmation. Everything appeared perfectly organized. Too perfectly. My cousin Brandon leaned back in his leather chair and crossed one leg over the other. "I told you this would finally settle everything," he said. His younger sister, Alicia, smiled without hiding her amusement. It was obvious Grandma trusted Mom more than anyone. Several relatives murmured their agreement. No one looked at me. I had grown used to that long ago. My father sat near the end of the table with his arms folded across his expensive navy suit. His expression never changed. Status had always mattered more to him than fairness. As long as the family appeared successful from the outside, he rarely questioned what happened inside these walls. My mother reached over and squeezed Aunt Denise's hand. "You've carried this family for years," she said softly. "You've earned this responsibility." Responsibility. Interesting choice of words. I lowered my eyes to the documents spread across the polished table. They thought they were witnessing the final chapter. What they didn't know was they were signing the opening page. Someone cleared his throat behind me. One of my older relatives smiled with practiced sympathy. "Naomi has always been independent." Another nodded. "She's ambitious." The word sounded almost like criticism. Then came the familiar sentence. "She was never really one of us anyway." A few quiet laughs floated around the room. Someone else whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear. "She always thought she was better than everybody." Another voice answered. "That's what happens when people forget where they came from." No one mentioned my degrees. No one mentioned the consulting firm I had built from nothing. No one mentioned the years I spent working while everyone else expected inheritances. Instead, they looked at my skin. Dark. Just like they always had. Growing up, relatives praised lighter cousins before I even entered the room. They called my complexion strong. They called theirs beautiful. The difference between those words had followed me my entire life. My aunt finally looked directly at me. "I hope you understand this isn't personal." I met her eyes. "I understand more than you realize." She smiled as though I had surrendered. She couldn't have been more wrong. The attorney gathered the completed documents into neat folders. "Congratulations," he said. "The transfer is officially complete." Around the table, relief spread across familiar faces. My cousins exchanged excited glances. My father finally relaxed his shoulders. My mother whispered something that made my aunt laugh. Everyone believed the matter had ended. No one noticed the weight of the black leather briefcase resting beside my chair. No one asked why I hadn't argued. No one wondered why I hadn't challenged a single sentence. Because they had mistaken silence for defeat. I stood, buttoned my charcoal blazer, and picked up my briefcase. "I should be going," I said calmly. My aunt looked almost disappointed. That's all you have to say? I offered the smallest smile. Grandmother believed timing was everything. The room grew unexpectedly quiet. What does that mean? Brandon asked. I paused at the conference room door before looking back one final time. I think all of you will eventually discover what she really intended. Without another word, I walked into the hallway. Behind me, conversation quickly resumed. They laughed. They congratulated each other. They celebrated what they believed they had won. They celebrated my silence, because they had absolutely no idea what was sitting inside my briefcase. Love always had conditions. Love always came with terms and conditions in my family. I simply wasn't old enough to read the fine print when my mother died. I was 7 years old when the funeral ended and the last casserole dish disappeared from the kitchen. The house that had been filled with whispered prayers and gentle hugs suddenly became quiet. I remember standing beside the front window, watching unfamiliar cars drive away while wondering whether grief always sounded like closing doors. That afternoon, my Aunt Denise rested a hand on my shoulder. You'll stay with us now, she said. Her voice sounded warm. Her eyes never did. Everyone called her generous for taking me in. Church members praised her kindness. Neighbors admired her sacrifice. They looked at our family portrait and saw a woman opening her home to her late sister's daughter. They never saw what happened after the front door closed. From the beginning, there was an invisible line inside that house. Her children belonged. I occupied space. Every morning followed the same routine. Brandon and Alicia ate breakfast before school while I packed lunches, wiped counters, and fed the dog. If I finished early, another chore appeared before I could sit down. You're helping the family, Aunt Denise always reminded me. Helping slowly became serving. When report cards arrived, the differences became impossible to ignore. One spring afternoon, I carried home a report card filled with straight A's. I placed it carefully on the kitchen counter while Aunt Denise stirred a pot of chicken stew. I did really well this semester, I said. She glanced at the paper for barely 3 seconds. That's nice. Nothing more. An hour later Brandon walked through the front door holding a report card covered with C's and one lonely B. Aunt Denise smiled so brightly the entire room seemed warmer. I knew you could do it. She hugged him. She called my father before dinner. She ordered pizza to celebrate. I quietly folded my own report card and slipped it inside my backpack. That became our tradition. My victories stayed silent. Their ordinary moments became family celebrations. My father noticed the difference. He simply chose not to challenge it. Whenever I asked why things felt so unequal, he answered without looking away from whatever business magazine rested in his hands. Life isn't about fairness. It's about protecting the family's reputation. Those words followed me for years. Apparently, protecting the family never included protecting me. Family reunions hurt even more. Every summer my grandmother hosted cookouts beneath enormous oak trees behind her house. Smoke drifted from the grill while old R&B songs floated through warm afternoon air. Children chased each other across freshly cut grass as adults compared careers, salaries, and expensive vacations. Then came the comments. They're such beautiful light-skinned children. Alicia has her mother's complexion. Brandon photographs so well. Someone inevitably turned toward me. Naomi is strong-looking. Another relative smiled politely. She'll need confidence. They always spoke as though I couldn't hear them. As though dark skin required an explanation. I learned to smile before anyone could mistake my silence for weakness. Inside, every word settled somewhere deep. One afternoon my grandmother quietly found me sitting alone beneath the old pecan tree. You don't have to earn love, she whispered. I looked toward the house where everyone laughed together. Then why does it feel like I do? She sighed instead of answering. At the time, I thought silence meant uncertainty. Years later, I realized silence often hides painful truth. As I grew older, I worked harder. Honor society. Scholarships. Internships. Late nights studying while everyone else watched television downstairs. Every accomplishment earned another reminder to stay humble. Meanwhile, Brandon quit jobs after 2 weeks and somehow remained full of potential. Alicia changed majors 3 different times and everyone admired her finding herself. I built opportunities. They inherited expectations. The older I became, the clearer everything looked. Love wasn't unconditional inside our family. It flowed toward whoever protected the image Aunt Denise wanted the world to believe. Everything changed the day she introduced us to Richard Holloway. He arrived wearing an expensive charcoal suit, polished shoes, and a smile practiced in boardrooms. His silver watch probably cost more than my first year's college tuition. He shook my father's hand confidently. "I've heard wonderful things about this family." My aunt beamed beside him. "Richard develops communities," she explained proudly. "He transforms neighborhoods." I noticed something else. He controlled every conversation without appearing to. Whenever financial questions surfaced, he answered with polished confidence while avoiding specifics. His vocabulary impressed people. His details never did. Over the following months he appeared at nearly every family dinner. Soon he convinced Aunt Denise to invest in several commercial redevelopment projects. He spoke endlessly about appreciation percentages, tax advantages, and exclusive investment opportunities. Everyone admired his success. I noticed inconsistencies. Property values that seemed inflated. Ownership structures unnecessarily complicated. Limited liability companies layered beneath holding companies. The paperwork felt designed to confuse instead of clarify. When I politely questioned one presentation, Richard smiled. "You're very observant." It sounded like a compliment. It wasn't. His eyes measured me differently after that evening. Weeks later I arrived early for another meeting at my aunt's house. Voices drifted from the study before anyone realized I was standing outside the half-open door. Richard spoke first. "She's smart." A brief pause followed. Then he lowered his voice. "But she'll never have the power to stop us." The night I stopped begging by 11:48 p.m., the city outside my apartment had finally grown quiet. Rain tapped softly against the living room window, and distant traffic blended into a low hum that almost sounded peaceful. My heels rested beside the front door where I had kicked them off without thinking. My blazer still hung over the back of the dining chair, carrying the faint scent of expensive perfume and polished wood from the attorney's office where my family had celebrated taking everything they believed belonged to them. I stood in the middle of my apartment without turning on another light. The darkness felt honest. It didn't pretend to love me. My grandmother's photograph sat on the bookshelf across the room. The silver frame caught the glow from the streetlights outside, making her smile appear softer than I remembered. I whispered. The words barely left my lips. For years, I had convinced myself that one more achievement would finally change everything. Another degree. Another promotion. Another award. Another reason for my family to look at me with pride instead of obligation. None of it had mattered. When I earned scholarships, they called me lucky. When I became a corporate consultant, they said I was obsessed with work. When clients trusted me with multi-million-dollar negotiations, my father simply nodded and changed the subject. Nothing I accomplished had ever been enough. Not because I lacked value. Because they had already decided mine. I lowered myself onto the couch and stared at the ceiling. The silence wrapped itself around me. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to admit something I had spent my entire life avoiding. I wasn't grieving the money. I was grieving the family I kept pretending still existed. The realization hurt more than any legal document ever could. A tear slipped down my cheek. I brushed it away before another followed. Then the doorbell rang. I looked at the clock. 11:53 p.m. Nobody visited that late. I crossed the apartment quietly and looked through the peephole. Harold Brooks stood outside holding a worn leather briefcase beneath one arm. Relief replaced surprise. I opened the door immediately. "Mr. Brooks." He smiled gently. "I figured you might still be awake. I don't think I could have slept tonight." He stepped inside without another word. Harold had practiced law for nearly 40 years before retiring. Long before I earned my first internship, he had become the mentor my own family never chose to be. He had taught me that preparation always defeated emotion inside a courtroom. Tonight his expression looked heavier than usual. "I heard about today's meeting," he said. "News travels quickly. It usually does when money is involved." He nodded slowly. "Especially 2,850,000. Neither of us spoke for several moments. Finally, he placed the old briefcase on my dining table. "I've been waiting years for tonight." My heart skipped. "What do you mean?" Instead of answering immediately, he opened the locks with careful precision. Inside rested several thick envelopes secured by red legal ribbons. There was also a small black flash drive. And one sealed package addressed in handwriting I recognized instantly. My grandmother's. The room suddenly felt smaller. I reached toward the envelope before stopping myself. "When?" "She prepared these almost 6 years before she passed away." I looked up. "She expected this?" Harold's eyes met mine. "She hoped it would never become necessary." He carefully removed the first document. "This is the original trust agreement." Another followed. "These are the authentic property deeds." Then another. "These contain financial records she instructed me to protect." Finally, he held up the flash drive between two fingers. "And this." His voice became quieter. "Contains years of financial evidence connected to Richard Holloway." The name settled heavily between us. I stared at the small device. "What kind of evidence?" "Shell companies." He placed it carefully beside the trust documents. "Undisclosed ownership interests." Another folder joined the growing stack. "Fraudulent appraisals." Then another. "Wire transfers." My breathing slowed. "What they didn't know was your grandmother noticed discrepancies years before anyone else." I looked back at her handwriting on the sealed envelope. "She never trusted him." "No." Harold shook his head. "She trusted you." The words reached places inside me that had remained empty for years. I carefully opened the envelope. Inside rested a handwritten letter. My grandmother's elegant script filled every page. "Naomi. If you're reading this, it means the people I loved most chose control over truth." My vision blurred. Harold remained silent while I continued reading. "She wrote about integrity. About patience. About the difference between revenge and justice. Most of all, she wrote about me. She described strengths I had never believed anyone noticed. My discipline. My compassion. My refusal to compromise my principles." At the bottom of the final page, one sentence stood alone. "Never fight to be accepted by people determined to misunderstand you." I folded the letter carefully. The ache inside my chest hadn't disappeared. It had transformed. For years, I had chased approval. Tonight, I understood something far more valuable. Approval could be withheld. Truth could not. I organized every document into neat stacks across my dining table. Trust agreement. Property deeds. Financial records. Digital evidence. Each piece fit together like a puzzle my grandmother had begun assembling long before anyone realized a crime existed. Harold watched quietly. "I've never seen you this calm after being hurt." I looked toward the rain-covered window. I'm not calm. No? I shook my head. I'm finished confusing forgiveness with surrender. A faint smile crossed his face. Good. Because strategy always begins where emotion ends. He closed the empty briefcase and stood. As he reached the front door, he paused. They think they won today. I glanced at the folders covering my table. They celebrated the wrong ending. After he left, I remained awake until nearly 3 in the morning. The rain finally stopped. So did something else. The desperate hope that one more sacrifice would finally earn my family's love. For the first time in my life, I stopped asking to belong. They thought they had already won. The morning after Harold Brooks left my apartment, I stopped thinking like a daughter. I started thinking like an attorney preparing for trial. Grief had spent years guiding my decisions. It had convinced me that one more conversation might heal old wounds, that one more sacrifice might finally earn acceptance. That version of me disappeared somewhere between my grandmother's handwritten letter and the stack of original legal documents spread across my dining table. By Monday morning, I walked into my consulting firm's headquarters carrying the black leather briefcase that no one in my family knew existed. The lobby smelled of fresh coffee and polished marble. Employees greeted me with warm smiles as elevators chimed across the open atrium. For the first time in days, I felt something stronger than disappointment. Purpose. At exactly 8:30 a.m., I stepped into the conference room where 3 members of my investigative team were already waiting. Marcus, our lead forensic accountant, opened his laptop before I even sat down. You said this couldn't leave the room, he said. It can't, I replied. I placed my grandmother's trust documents, property deeds, and Harold's evidence on the conference table. I need every transaction connected to Richard Holloway and every company he's touched during the last 12 years. Marcus raised an eyebrow. That's a massive request. So is the damage I believe he's hiding. Across the table, investigator Lila Grant quietly organized the files into separate categories. Do we know what we're looking for? Not yet, I answered. But I know fraud leaves footprints. No one asked another question. That was why I trusted them. Over the next several weeks, our office transformed into something that resembled a financial command center. Whiteboards filled with company names. Timelines stretched across entire walls. Bank transfers, corporate registrations, and property records slowly connected into a picture far larger than I expected. Every evening, another missing piece appeared. What they didn't know was that every lie they had ever signed eventually led back to another document. Marcus called me into his office late one Thursday afternoon. You need to see this. He turned his monitor toward me. Richard Holloway controlled more than 30 limited liability companies. Most existed only on paper. Money flowed from one corporation into another before disappearing into offshore accounts hidden beneath layers of shell businesses. He inflated property values, Marcus explained. Then borrowed against fake equity. Exactly. I studied the spreadsheet. Millions of dollars had moved through accounts that never should have existed. The numbers were staggering. But the people behind those numbers mattered far more. Lila walked in carrying another folder. I visited several neighborhoods listed in Holloway's redevelopment projects. What did you find? She hesitated. Families. She laid photographs across the table. An elderly couple stood outside a boarded-up home. They lost everything after trusting his investment program. Another photograph showed a small neighborhood grocery store. This business had operated for 34 years. I picked up the picture carefully. What happened? His development company promised expansion funding. She looked down. The owner signed documents he didn't fully understand. The grocery store closed 8 months later. Another folder revealed a family-owned restaurant. Then a daycare center. Then a community pharmacy. One by one, Black-owned businesses disappeared beneath polished presentations and impossible financial promises. Richard Holloway hadn't simply stolen money. He had stolen neighborhoods. I sat quietly for several moments. This case had stopped being personal. Now it belonged to every family whose future had quietly disappeared behind legal language they were never meant to understand. Meanwhile, life inside my own family continued exactly as I expected. They celebrated. Every Sunday my cousins flooded social media with photographs of expensive dinners, luxury shopping trips, and smiling captions about family blessings. Brandon even posted a picture standing beside one of the newly acquired commercial properties. Hard work always pays off. I almost smiled. Hard work hadn't purchased any of it. Deception had. One Saturday afternoon, I attended my grandmother's memorial luncheon. Not because I wanted to. Because I needed to observe. The dining room buzzed with laughter as expensive china clinked against polished wood. My aunt looked happier than I had seen her in years. Richard Holloway sat beside her, charming every relative at the table. My arrival barely interrupted the conversation. Brandon looked at me and laughed. So the corporate superstar finally made time for us. I had an opening. Alicia sipped her wine. You still working all those ridiculous hours? I enjoy my work. She smiled with practiced sympathy. You know. She leaned back in her chair. Not everyone has to prove themselves forever. Brandon laughed. Seriously, Naomi. When are you going to accept your place? Around the table several relatives nodded. No one defended me. They never had. I calmly folded my napkin beside my plate. My place? Brandon shrugged. You've always been the ambitious one. His grin widened. Sometimes people should just be grateful for what they have. I met his eyes. I am. He mistook my answer for surrender. They all did. They had absolutely no idea every insult made waiting easier. Every arrogant smile bought me another day to strengthen the case. Every careless conversation revealed another weakness. A week later Marcus entered my office carrying the final audit report. He placed it gently in front of me. We finished. I slowly opened the binder. Hundreds of pages. Financial analysis. Property transfers. Wire records. Witness statements. Forensic accounting summaries. Everything connected. Everything matched. Every missing piece finally rested exactly where it belonged. I closed the report and looked out across the city skyline. The evidence wasn't growing anymore. It was complete. The room full of witnesses, the ballroom looked beautiful from a distance. Crystal chandeliers spilled warm light across polished marble floors. A string quartet played near the grand staircase while servers moved quietly between round tables covered in white linen and fresh orchids. Conversations floated through the room in measured tones, the kind that belonged to people who were accustomed to influence rather than impressed by it. Judges. Managing partners from major law firms. Bank presidents. CEOs. City officials. Community leaders. Journalists. Nearly every important voice in Atlanta's business community had gathered for the annual Generations Forward charity gala. It was exactly where Richard Holloway wanted to celebrate another successful year. It was exactly where I wanted the truth to meet him. I stepped out of the elevator at 6:58 p.m., wearing a tailored black pantsuit with narrow gold piping along the lapels. My grandmother used to say black represented dignity while gold represented earned victory. Tonight, they felt less like clothing. More like armor. My legal team waited near the entrance. Harold Brooks adjusted his tie before smiling. You look ready. I've been ready for years. He nodded toward the sealed document cases our associates carried. Everything has been authenticated twice. I know. Once those are opened, I understand. There would be no turning back. Inside the ballroom, Richard Holloway stood near the stage surrounded by investors and reporters. My Aunt Denise remained beside him wearing an elegant emerald gown, proudly introducing him as the visionary who had transformed neighborhoods and created opportunity. The irony almost made me smile. Those neighborhoods had never recovered. The opportunities had belonged only to him. When Richard noticed me, his confident smile widened. Naomi. He extended one hand. I wasn't sure you'd come. I shook it briefly. I never miss important meetings. His eyes narrowed for only a second before the smile returned. I've heard you're still consulting. I am. He chuckled loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. That's respectable work. The pause that followed carried its own meaning. But consulting isn't exactly building an empire. Several people laughed politely. I simply looked at him. Silence has an unusual effect on arrogant people. They often mistake it for surrender. Richard certainly did. He leaned closer. You've always been intelligent. His smile sharpened. Just not influential. I answered calmly. Influence should survive scrutiny. For the first time that evening, his expression tightened. Before he could respond, Aunt Denise joined us. There you are. She looked me up and down. I'm glad you decided to support the foundation. I came to support something. She smiled without understanding. I'm happy to hear that. Across the ballroom, my legal associates quietly entered through separate doors. Each carried identical leather portfolios. Nobody noticed them. Not yet. Dinner began shortly afterward. As speeches filled the room, I watched Richard move confidently from table to table, accepting compliments and promising future developments. Every sentence sounded polished. Every gesture appeared carefully rehearsed. He believed reputation was stronger than evidence. He was wrong. After dessert, the master of ceremonies invited Richard to deliver the keynote address. The applause echoed beneath the chandeliers. Richard walked confidently toward the podium. My friends. He smiled broadly. Our city continues to grow because people are willing to dream bigger than yesterday. The audience listened attentively. He spoke about economic development, community investment, generational prosperity. Words flowed easily. Truth never appeared. Then he noticed me again. Standing quietly near the back of the ballroom. He smiled. I also want to recognize talented young professionals who remind us that hard work still matters. Several heads turned toward me. Richard continued. Miss Naomi Williams has built a respectable consulting career. Polite applause followed. He wasn't finished. But there's a difference between advising successful people. He adjusted the microphone. And actually becoming one. A few uncomfortable laughs spread through the audience. I remained perfectly still. He mistook my silence for embarrassment. So he kept talking. Experience teaches us that some people spend their lives analyzing success because they'll never create it themselves. More laughter. Harold glanced toward me. I gave the smallest nod. The signal had been agreed upon weeks earlier. Quietly, almost invisibly, my associates began moving through the ballroom. One portfolio opened. Then another. Then another. Sealed document packets appeared at every table. Judges received copies. Reporters received copies. Bank executives received copies. Federal investigators attending as guests received copies. No announcement interrupted the speech. Only paper. Richard continued speaking. Real leadership requires courage. Guests slowly looked down. Brows furrowed. Pages turned. Whispers replaced applause. Richard noticed the change. What is this? Nobody answered immediately. He looked toward one table. Then another. His smile began fading. Inside every packet rested certified property records, wire transfer summaries, forensic accounting reports, corporate ownership charts, sworn witness statements, copies of my grandmother's original trust documents. Every page carried official certifications. Every signature had been verified. Richard looked toward me. What have you done? I still didn't answer. He laughed nervously. This is ridiculous. A federal judge sitting near the front slowly removed his reading glasses. A banking executive flipped directly to the forensic audit. One investigative journalist quietly reached for her phone. The room no longer belonged to Richard. It belonged to evidence. He stepped away from the podium. This is fabricated. Harold finally stood. No. His voice remained calm. It's authenticated. Richard pointed toward me. She's trying to destroy me. I simply watched. He turned toward the audience. She's angry because her family made financial decisions she didn't like. No one responded. The silence frightened him more than any accusation could. He loosened his tie. You people don't understand how development works. Still nothing. His confidence began cracking. I moved money because everyone does. Several reporters immediately wrote those words down. Realizing what he had admitted, Richard stopped speaking. Too late. He looked toward Aunt Denise. Tell them. She stared at the documents spread across the table. Her hands trembled. Richard. She turned another page. What are these companies? He hesitated. Business structures. She looked again. Why are there 32 of them? No answer. What are these offshore accounts? Still nothing. For the first time since I had known her, Aunt Denise looked genuinely afraid. She slowly raised her eyes toward me. You knew. I knew enough to ask questions. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. You let me keep signing. I never forced you to ignore the answers. Those words landed harder than anger ever could. Across the ballroom, two federal investigators quietly identified themselves. One approached Richard. Another requested that the document packets remain untouched. The room fell completely silent. Richard looked around desperately, searching for someone willing to defend him. No one moved. His influence had disappeared faster than it had been built. He had spent years believing confidence could replace accountability. Tonight, accountability finally arrived. I picked up my briefcase and prepared to leave. Richard called after me. This isn't over. I paused only long enough to answer. It was over the day you started believing nobody was paying attention. Without another word, I walked toward the ballroom doors. Behind me, investigators continued asking questions. Reporters gathered around the tables. Guests quietly compared documents. The celebration had become an investigation. The loudest person in the room became the weakest. And I never raised my voice. Karma never needed my help. Justice moved much more quietly than revenge ever could. 3 days after the charity gala, I arrived at my office before sunrise. The city was still waking up, and the streets below my window carried only a handful of headlights cutting through the morning fog. My phone vibrated constantly, but I ignored it while pouring myself a cup of black coffee. For years, I had imagined what accountability might look like. I thought it would feel triumphant. Instead, it felt heavy. By 8:15 a.m., the first official announcement appeared. Federal investigators had executed search warrants on multiple properties connected to Richard Holloway's development companies. Financial institutions immediately froze millions of dollars in corporate assets while regulators suspended several pending real estate projects. News stations interrupted their regular programming to report that a respected businessman now faced allegations of fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. The empire he had spent years polishing began collapsing before lunchtime. What they didn't know was that the evidence had been so thoroughly documented that every attempt to deny it only created another contradiction. Marcus stepped into my office carrying a fresh case summary. "The court approved temporary asset freezes," he said. "How much?" He glanced down at the report. "Approximately $41,800,000 across multiple accounts." I nodded once. "No celebration?" I looked back toward the skyline. "There will be families reading those headlines today." He understood immediately. This had never been about watching someone fall. It had always been about stopping the damage. Over the next 2 weeks, civil lawsuits multiplied. Former business partners came forward. Whistleblowers contacted investigators. Retired homeowners described losing their life savings after trusting Richard's investment presentations. Owners of small black-owned businesses shared contracts they had never fully understood, each one carrying hidden clauses designed to transfer control away from them. Every interview revealed another victim. Every document confirmed another lie. Meanwhile, my aunt's world quietly unraveled. She had signed agreements without asking difficult questions because success had looked convincing. Luxury dinners, exclusive events, and glowing newspaper profiles had made skepticism feel unnecessary. Now those same signatures appeared in legal filings. She wasn't accused of creating the fraud. She was accused of helping it continue. One afternoon she called me. For several seconds neither of us spoke. Finally she whispered, "I didn't know." "I believe you." Another silence settled between us. "Then why didn't you stop me?" I closed my office door before answering. I tried to ask questions. You called them attacks. I tried to slow everything down. You called me jealous. My aunt began crying softly. I thought I was protecting my children. I answered as gently as I could. You protected an illusion. She never argued. There was nothing left to defend. A few days later my father asked if we could meet. We sat across from each other inside a quiet cafe where neither of us had been before. He looked older than I remembered. The confidence that had once filled every conversation had been replaced by long pauses. "I owe you something," he said. I waited. An apology. Those words would have meant everything years earlier. Now they simply sounded honest. "I believed discipline made strong families," he continued. "I confused obedience with love." He stared into his untouched coffee. "Every time I stayed silent, I told you that keeping peace mattered more than protecting you." I didn't interrupt. I was wrong. The admission carried no excuses. Only regret. Before we left, he looked at me with tired eyes. "I hope someday you remember me for saying this instead of everything I failed to say before." I'll remember both. It wasn't forgiveness. It was truth. My mother reached out several days later. She didn't ask about the lawsuits. She didn't mention the investigation. Instead she quietly said, "Loyalty without justice destroys families." Those words lingered with me long after the call ended. For the first time in my life, she understood what I had lived with for decades. Brandon and Alicia handled everything differently. The expensive cars disappeared first. Then came the luxury apartment. Their social media accounts, once filled with vacations and designer shopping bags, suddenly went silent. When they finally spoke to each other, it wasn't with affection. It was with blame. "You told Mom Richard was trustworthy. You wanted the investments too. You should have read the paperwork." "No, you should have." The golden children who had always stood together now searched for someone else to carry responsibility. I watched from a distance. Not because I enjoyed it. Because there was nothing left for me to fix. Reporters continued calling. Television producers requested interviews. Business magazines wanted exclusive stories about the woman whose evidence had exposed one of the city's largest financial scandals. I declined every invitation. Justice did not need my face on a magazine cover. It needed the truth to remain louder than my name. One evening Harold Brooks visited my office after work. He looked around the quiet conference room and smiled. "You seem peaceful." I expected to feel victorious. And? I looked through the window as the sun disappeared behind the skyline. "Peace lasts longer." He nodded with quiet satisfaction. Outside, life continued. Inside, I finally understood something my grandmother had tried to teach me years before. I didn't ruin their lives. Their own choices simply reached the finish line. I finally chose myself 6 months after the investigations ended. I unlocked the front door of a building my grandmother had dreamed about long before I understood why it mattered. Morning sunlight poured through wide front windows, warming polished hardwood floors that still smelled faintly of fresh paint. Volunteers arranged chairs inside the meeting room while children laughed in the hallway outside. A bronze plaque near the entrance carried a name that made me smile every time I read it. The Evelyn Williams Foundation for Generational Wealth. My grandmother never had the chance to see it. In many ways, she had built it anyway. The recovered assets from the civil settlements never felt like victory money. They felt like responsibility. After the courts approved the distribution process, I directed a significant portion toward creating free legal education programs, estate planning workshops, scholarship funds, and financial literacy classes for Black families who had spent generations building wealth only to lose it through misinformation, predatory contracts, or the absence of proper legal protection. Every Saturday morning, our conference room filled with grandparents bringing old property deeds tucked inside worn envelopes. Young couples arrived with notebooks full of questions about trusts, wills, and business ownership. Small business owners learned how to recognize unfair contract language before signing away years of hard work. Watching those conversations reminded me why the fight had always mattered. Not because my family had betrayed me. Because too many families had experienced the same betrayal in different forms. The apartment buildings my grandmother once hoped would remain community housing became affordable homes again. The commercial properties Richard Holloway had used for personal gain were transformed into spaces where local businesses could finally grow without hidden traps waiting beneath polished paperwork. For the first time, her legacy belonged to the people she had always wanted to protect. One quiet afternoon, my assistant walked into my office carrying a small envelope. It was hand-delivered. I recognized Aunt Denise's handwriting immediately. Inside rested a short note. "Naomi, if you're willing, I'd like to meet one last time. There are things I should have said years ago. I'm sorry." I folded the letter carefully and placed it back inside the envelope. There was a time when I would have rushed to that meeting, hoping one honest conversation could erase years of silence. That version of me no longer existed. Forgiveness had already happened inside my heart. Reconciliation required trust. Trust required choices neither of us could rewrite. I asked my assistant to send a respectful reply. "I truly wish you peace. I also hope you understand that healing sometimes continues along separate paths." There was no anger in those words. Only acceptance. As the months passed, people often asked how I found the strength to move forward after everything that had happened. The truth surprised them. Strength didn't arrive the day Richard Holloway was exposed. It didn't appear when the lawsuits ended or when the headlines disappeared. Strength arrived the night I finally accepted that my worth had never depended on people who measured love by control, appearance, or status. For years, I believed I had lost an inheritance. Looking back, I realized I had received something far greater. Money can disappear. Property can change hands. Reputations can rise and fall. But self-worth becomes untouchable once you stop placing it in someone else's hands. If you're listening to my story today, maybe you've spent years trying to earn love that always seemed to come with conditions. Maybe you've worked harder, stayed quieter, forgiven longer, and hoped that one more sacrifice would finally make someone choose you. I understand that feeling. I lived inside it for most of my life. But I also learned something my grandmother quietly tried to teach me from the beginning. Your value is never determined by the people who fail to recognize it. Sometimes the greatest act of courage isn't exposing the people who hurt you. Sometimes it's choosing yourself without waiting for their permission. And once you do, everything begins to change. The day you stop begging for a seat at their table is the day you realize you were always meant to build your own.